Hello, once again, my friends. Thank you for joining me on the Aquilani History Podcast. I hope you are all well, truly. Before pressing on with the series, I would like to give a couple of shout outs to Lord Kenazo 144 as well as Onarogene Orogun 1436 for your continued support, likes, and kind words. I see you. Thank you very much. As well as my friend Kenny Owolabi, thank you. I see you. And the Cake Queen for promising to listen again and again whilst at work. I love you loads. Lastly, but definitely not the least, happy belated birthday to Mr. Bastos, the original Mr. Bastos, my dad, and all my special February patutis as well. Sending you much love. We are still on the history of Warri, Red Rivers. It's the title of this series, the story of trade, war, politics, and the merchant princes of the Niger Delta. This is episode 3. On previous episodes, we explored the founding of the Kingdom of Warri, its flirtations with Christian monks to curry favor with Portugal and the Pope. We've looked at the rise and fall of slavery with palm oil replacing it as its new export. In today's episode, titled Interregnum, the throne of Warri lays empty and the entire kingdom is plunged into anarchy. Join me as we navigate the fields of fire that Warri evolves into. The wiser Olus of Warri and the powerful families saw that the handwriting was on the wall and began to diversify and clean up their slave money by investing in palm oil trade. It was beginning to look lucrative indeed. Demand was there in Europe, and a logistic framework for moving produce to the buyers on ships was not entirely new to them. They'd after all been the middlemen for much of the slave trade. There were some differences to trading palm oil though. It had to be harvested and then processed. And the harvesting was usually done by men and the processing was done by women. You usually take 3 to 5 people about half a week to produce a tin of palm oil. Every aspect of it was very labor intensive and it was usually a family venture. So as you all know, the palm oil trees were not mobile, and they existed as wild trees in the palm oil belt deep in the hinterland. The processed or semi-processed goods then had to be transported to the sea, usually over hundreds of miles, and unlike slaves, palm oil barrels could not transport themselves, no matter how much you flogged them. So the Yoruba producers had no easy access to the coast and would have to go through the territory of the Ishekiri middlemen. So to make it mutually beneficial, the Ishekiris, who were actually the logistic experts, would set up markets in the hinterland, buy up the produce from the Yoruba producers, and use their domestic slaves to transport the palm oil to the coast, where they will wait for European ships to arrive, usually in a seasonal fashion. For that will be when it will be safe for their ships to cross the several bars into the designated rivers. The price and volume of the palm oil kept on ramping up exponentially over the decades. In 1780, only 40 tons were traded, and this had gone up to 13,600 tons by 1839, and in the following 100 years, it would reach 500,000 tons. In terms of price, merchants were expected to make as much as 300% profits at the height of the trade. The price of a barrel in Bonny was £19 in 1850. Today, that would be worth about £3,200. And then it's sold in Liverpool for about £50, which in today's money would be about £8,400. In the United Kingdom, the former slave port of Liverpool became the hotbed for palm oil. After 1807, when the trade in slaves was outlawed, former slave traders engaged in the new trade of palm oil. One of such pioneers was Charles Horsfall. He'd been a slave owner and slave trader, and when slaves were emancipated, he actually received a payout of about £11,700, nearly $2 million in today's money. He would go on to be mayor of Liverpool. He and other capital flush merchants initially dominated the trade of palm oil, and it was only after a few decades when smaller traders would be able to break in. On both sides of the divide, the business was a hard one for Africans and European workers as well. So he attracted a certain character of men, and they were often referred to as palm oil ruffians. If you were European, being involved in palm oil trade meant you'd spend several months on the sea, entering the river mouths on the Atlantic Ocean, where you'd be met by representatives of the local monarch, in this case the Olu. These representatives would board the ship of the Europeans and exact their taxes. So before the Europeans were allowed to start trading, they had to pay komi, which is a fee or a duty in order to get permission to start trading. They also had to pay for the pilots guiding the boats. They also had to pay something called shake hands after every agreement was reached, as well as several other dashes and gifts. I mean, modern Agberos don't do past this one. The Europeans could now trade on the riverbanks with the blessings of and under the protection and regulation of the Olu and local chiefs. Initially, the Europeans had no residences, no shops, no warehouses. They operated solely from their ships. In time, they would come to build factories along the riverbanks, which served as the local base of their operations. So, all the fees have been exacted here, and then they offload their European goods to the Shekiri middlemen. But usually, there's no palm oil initially. It's all on credit or trust. So the European trader gives payment ahead of time as credit to the middlemen to secure the palm oil from the Urubu oil producers in the hinterland. And this was one of the reasons why it was such an expensive venture to go in. It was capital intensive, and up to 40% of one's capital might be tied up in trust or credit. How were they certain that they would get the palm oil that they just paid for? Well, they were never certain. That's why it's called trust, no? It was a big gamble, and many times it was a matter of otilo. And indeed, it regularly got quite rough with seizing of properties, attacks and reprisals. The local chiefs, that's the Shekiri chiefs, often also had an African association and fixed prices, or they could close off their rivers to trading when things wasn't going their way. Then there was also the problem of the Ijaw pirates doing their own form of oil bunkering. So this trade was not for the soft-livered. The whole business could be quite rough and unregulated, and the European merchants would try to limit their risk, calling for more protection from the British government in form of consular or ambassadorial representation, and for Her Majesty's government to have more direct involvement. In the meantime, the trade was based on who knew whom and whom trusted whom. The wealthier an Ishekiri middleman was, the less likely he needed to collect trust or credit, and the more likely they were to get business done. Nana, for instance, is famously known to have displayed boldly on his trade canoes, no trust. I mean, that's some impressive financial risk there, isn't it? So it can be clearly seen that the rich Ishekiri middlemen fundamentally held the power here. The Urubu producers in the hinterland could not get to the coast to trade, and the Europeans could not penetrate to the source. Why? Because they didn't know the way. Charts had not been developed. They lacked the economies of large scale to transport such produce in waterways where their ships wouldn't have been able to get to. And most importantly, malaria and other tropical illnesses. It was pretty much a death sentence for a non-immune foreigner to catch something like this, especially as even the best Western medicine at that point in time understood it poorly. So the middlemen retained their monopoly and often put a united front to the Europeans. But they also often fought amongst one another in trying to establish markets on the Urubu side to buy the actual oil. Chaotic as it seemed, everyone settled into this form of business. Like I said, the Europeans will eventually start building factories, which was more like a fort or warehouse or headquarters from where they could store their goods and acted as a land base rather than stay on their ships to trade. They were basically having more and more of a permanent presence on the coasts of the Niger Delta. So these merchants, in association with the African trading states, controlled between them all the trade coming out of the rivers on the Niger Delta coast. In Warri Kingdom, the bulk of the middlemen came from two powerful families, the royal house of Emaye and the noble house of Olugboshere. And we shall find out a little bit more about these families. At the end of 1700s, Olu Erejua died and was succeeded by his son, Joao Akengbua, who was the longest reigning Olu. He was on the throne from 1795 to 1848. Akengbua is remembered for being the king whose death started the Interregnum of 88 years in the Warri Kingdom. He had lived a long life, but an apocryphal story tells of a curse that was placed on his reign and his kingdom. There was a certain Ifa priest, and some sources say an Ife priest, who had somehow managed to incur the anger of the king and was therefore sentenced to death. Upon arriving at his place of execution, the priest had placed a curse, warning that if his blood was spilled, King Akengboa's throne would lay empty and all the attendant problems that come with this for 2 generations. Make whatever you will of that story, but there had been problems throughout Akengboa's reign. There was discord between his heirs and there was rebellion amongst his chiefs. His first son, Omateye, and fourth son, Orishemone, seemed to be in some kind of rivalry. One disagreement led to Omateye destroying Orishemone's house, King Akengboa had mediated, subsequently building his younger son a new house and personally inspecting a new settlement for him at Usele, where the younger prince built a new town. This was a bit unusual, for it was extremely rare for a reigning Olu to step foot outside the capital, Ode-Shekiri. Perhaps he broke tradition to prevent a civil war between his sons. Perhaps he could sense the general tension and unease in his kingdom, and therefore went the extra mile to make sure peace reigned. The reign of Akengboa is also remembered for some of the rebellions. It appears there were a series of rebellions during his reign. If you remember the three paramount chiefs of the kingdom, the Ologboshere, or the prime minister, the Yashere, or the war chief, and the Owangoe, who was the crowner, it just so happened that all three of them left the kingdom during his reign and were quite reluctant to return. The prime minister's son also happened to be the Owangoe, so two of the top three titles in the land were in one house, and this house will come to be known as the House of Ologboshere and would feature prominently in the near future. So Warri was in decline by the 1800s. Ships no longer sailed the Forcados, which is the lowest river of the three. Remember the three rivers? Benin, Escravos, and Forcados. So ships no longer sailed the Forcados and conducted most of their trade in the Benin River, which is the topmost river in the Warri Kingdom. So there was general migration to the towns along the Benin River. More so, slavery had been outlawed by 1807, and the main hub for legitimate trade seemed to be the Benin River. When the three paramount chiefs left the capital, they went to settle around the Benin River. So by the end of Akengboa's reign, there was a sense of instability and volatility. It seemed that the entire kingdom was a little bit dry, hot, and crispy, perfect conditions to start a bushfire. Fate would decide which direction the kingdom moved. Fate would either be the calming wind and soothe peace over the land, or fate might be the demented arsonist with itchy fingers holding a match in her hands. Olu Joao Akengboa died on the 14th of June 1848. The king is dead. Long live the king. Barely had time passed for the news to be digested when 4 days later, his prince Omateye died mysteriously, sending shock waves over the land. The king and his heir were dead, but fate the arsonist was not done yet. But no sooner had this news settled when Prince Ejo, the brother of Omateye and the new heir presumptive, also died within 3 months when arrangements were being made for his installation as the new Olu. 3 kings in less than 3 months. The kings were dead. Long live anarchy. Fate and her itchy fingers had cast aside her matchbox and sat back smiling, admiring her blazing work, and boy, did the fires burn. A major disturbance led by the slaves of Omateye and Ejo was unleashed in Ode-Shekiri. Fueled by bitterness, they suspected foul play and determined that none of Akengboa's other sons will sit on the throne if their now late masters could not. They planned to massacre the remaining princes and damn the whole place to hell. Many of the princes were attacked. There was a mass exodus of royals and commoners out of the furnace that was Ode-Shekiri. Prince Orisemone, if you remember him, who had built a new town called Usele, had taken swift action and whisked the younger princes as well as the royal regalia to his new town of Usele, not very far from the capital. He mounted cannon on the shores of his rivers and had them fired regularly every day for 3 months as a show of force to dissuade the rampaging slaves from further pursuing the princes. The other royals fled as well to the banks of the Benin River and founded new towns on the south bank, whilst the noble house of Ologboshere that had previously fled in rebellion were already established on the northern bank of the Benin River and had been controlling the trade there. Before we press on, I would like to reintroduce the members of the royal house, occupiers of the south bank, as we have only recently met their north bank neighbors, the Ologbosheres. The royals on the south bank of the Benin River were collectively called the House of Emaye. Emaye was the wife of Oba Erejua, who was the father of King Akengboa. She was not Akengboa's mother though, and this point I will stress to prevent any unnecessary chest pain and sucking of teeth in a few moments. So Emaye was Akengboa's stepmother. She had royal children of her own, children of Erejua and step-siblings to Akengboa. Notable amongst them are 2 women, Uwala and Iye, also known as Dola. So Akengboa, Uwala and Dola are step-siblings. Now when Olu Akengboa's father died, he inherited his stepmother Emaye. And he did not just inherit her and keep her somewhere. She bore him 3 children, including his 2 heirs, Omateye and Ejo, who unfortunately died shortly after he did. If you found this uncomfortable, well, welcome to my world. Do take a seat. You've after all been drinking all this hot tea I've been serving. It is said that the 5 children of MIA were quite a close-knit bunch. Descended from Uwala is a grandson called Dore, and from Ie, a prince called Chanomi. So the names to remember, I know it's getting a bit complex, but the names to remember going forward, because remember, Akengbuwa, Omate, and Ejo have all died. So the remaining powerful members of the house of MIA are Uwala and Dola, the sisters, and their male descendants, Dore and Chanomi. Chanomi was a much older cousin of Dore, more like an uncle. And don't worry, I won't let you get confused. As I go along, I'll make it clear who is who. So that's the royal house of MIA. The 2 matriarchs, Uwala and Dola, and their male descendants, Chanomi and Dore. So that's the royal house of MIA, clustered on the south bank of the Benin River. On the north bank, we already know of the Ologboshiri and his son, the Uwangwe, who was also a top chief and he had migrated much earlier. The Uwangwe had 2 important sons, Idibofun and Diari. He also had a sister, and from her line would come 2 important men, Olomu and his son, Nana. So that's the house of Ologboshiri. Interestingly, one of the towns founded on the north bank was called Jakba, so it could be said that they Jakbad to Jakba. Isn't that deep? Together, these houses, that is the house of Ologboshiri and the royal house of MIA, balanced as they were across the Benin River, would come to hold nearly all the power and trade rights in Ishekiri land. The remaining royal princes were scattered around in Usele and around Ode Ishekiri, but they came third by some distance when compared to these other 2 families. Dola, one of the matriarchs of the royal house of MIA, stayed back in Ode Ishekiri and was able to restore some sort of order with her chief slave called Ebrimoni. The once beautiful town of Ode Ishekiri now had only a small royal base. Its towns, factories, and throne lay otherwise empty. In all this anarchy, certain miscreants took advantage, disrupting trade left, right, and center. There was increased looting, increased attacks, and disputes, and no one stood to benefit from the unrest. The European firms were understandably very concerned about this unrest and increase in attacks on their factories. They had the protection of the West African Squadron of the Royal British Navy, but these ships were stretched quite thin, covering a distance of about 250 miles. So the British merchants began to clamour for more protection and consular representation. So the Foreign Office of the British government would appoint consuls or ambassadors to protect British interests by going into agreements with the African kings and leaders. The first consul to be appointed was Consul B. Crofts, and was appointed in November of 1849. So a new period had begun of direct intervention by foreign powers in the Niger area. The job of consul or representative of British citizens in the area was a tedious one. There was one consul for the entire coastline of the Bight of Benin that was 250 miles long, so the consuls often delegated agents to act in the stead, as they could only be in one place at a time. Also, the British merchants had to rely on the goodwill and protection of whichever king or chief was in charge of the area they docked down. They even signed documents of protection. I have 2 examples below of these treaties of protection, so the African chiefs protecting the British merchants. One is from the house of Ologboshiri, the noble chiefs on the North Bank. This was signed by Idibofun and Diari, whom they actually called Jerry. I know, like, what the whole title, man. So basically they said, I, Idibofun and Diari of Jakpa on the Benin River, do hereby assure that until the unsettled state of things consequent upon there being no sovereign upon the throne of Warri is at an end, we will do our utmost ability and power to support the British traders and all honest and fair trade of any nation carried on in the Benin River and its connecting branches within the territory of Warri. Dated at Jakpa, the 2nd day of March, 1849. Another of such letters is from Ebrimoni, the slave of Dola, the matriarch of the house of MIA. And she stated that voluntarily, upon payment of agreed commie, she would undertake to protect with all her power and influence the British property deposited in this river on shore or afloat, and all the British agents and subjects of Her Britannic Majesty. So the situation is still such that it's the Ishekiri chiefs and middlemen offering protection to the British merchants. The British merchants still had good reason to be worried. There was a palpable concern for life and property, because by now several firms had established themselves along the bank of the Benin River with considerable stock of manpower and materials. They also had a significant amount of capital tied up in trust and credit given to Ishekiri middlemen. So the clamor for more protection and regularization of trade from the merchants would only increase, and over the following decades there will be a gradual reversal of roles. Where previously it had been the Olus and local chiefs offering protection, soon it will be them who will be forced to accept protection. So I'll quote a letter from one of the British merchants to a commander of one of the warships. He said, "Sir, I now address you on a subject of extensive importance to the safety of British property here. The Kingdom of Warri is at present without any person who has the province of conducting the affairs here to the benefit of European traders. Our trade is at present on a very insecure foundation, and if there is not soon some alteration made with regard to the European affairs here, I am sure that British property will be sacrificed to a serious amount. I have at present a large quantity of money out on credit, and I am apprehensive I shall never get it returned without your assistance. What we want in this country is the protectorate, until such a time there is a king selected by the people." He says some other things and he says, "I'm sorry to give you so much trouble, but here, as a British subject and agent, I must claim the protection of your flag for myself and any other agents who may arrive. I trust you being able to grant me the assistance within the next month certainly, or as early as possible." This was still reflecting this period of anarchy which lasted for 3 years after Oba Akengboa died and 2 of his heirs after him. There were still lots of attacks against European merchants. So in 1851, Consul Beecroft finally arrived in the All Rivers to bring peace once and for all. Episode 3 is done and dusted. I particularly like this episode. We're halfway through and it really is just starting. Thank you for sticking with me on this. The best is yet to come. I appreciate your support, your feedback, your suggestions. It means more than you know to me. I ask you again, greedy as I am, for more love and support. I mean, scoot closer, super close. Lolox this podcast with your likes, comments, and shares and help me grow. I really can't wait to speak to you soon, hopefully in a week's time, when the new episode will be released. Stay well and have a blessed weekend and week ahead. Love you loads.